Good morning, everybody. In case it's not morning where you are, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name is Michael Henry Tessler. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at MIT, and this work was done in collaboration with Polina Tsvilo-Dub at the University of Osnabrück, Jesse Snedeker at Harvard, Roger Levy at MIT. The title of this talk is Information Goals, Sentence Structure, and Comparison Class Inference. We live in a strange time. And it's a time where we relish being outside, ideally in a park with no other human beings around. And when there are humans, it's always better when there's friendly, furry creatures around as well. So let's say you're in this park and you see this majestic creature in front of you. You say, "Wow, now that's a dog." And your friend says, "Yeah, that Great Dane is big." As with other gradable adjectives, you know that when your friend says big, they mean to convey that if you were to put the referent on a scale of size, it would be quite high on that scale. Formally, this is achieved through a threshold semantics, where the adjective provides the scale, size, and beliefs are updated via a threshold updating rule. Lassiter and Goodman showed how you can embed this semantics inside a probabilistic model of language understanding to derive context-sensitive inferences and interpretations. And all this works very well for computing the meaning of the word big, but there is a more basic question left unanswered by this analysis. We computed the meaning of the word big by appealing to this distribution of sizes, but what is this distribution? In particular, for the Great Dane, there's at least two very plausible distributions. It could be the distribution of dogs, in which case the speaker meant to say that the referent is big for a dog. Or it could be the distribution of Great Danes, and the speaker might have meant that it's big for a Great Dane. Determining the comparison class is an understudied issue at the interface of semantics and pragmatics. If you were to take semantic composition seriously, you would suppose that the adjective combines syntactically with the noun to produce an interpretable adjectival phrase by using the noun as a comparison class. Like when you hear a big Great Dane, big is a function that takes in a noun, Great Dane, and returns to you a thing with a comparison class, big for a Great Dane. One might generalize this kind of account to allow for a mechanism that could grab non-syntactically modified nouns. But we also know that world knowledge plays a role in comparison class inferences. That is, Great Danes are big dogs. So when you hear a Great Dane described as big, you might just think that it's big for a dog. In our paper, we propose an inferential-based hypothesis, where we ask what goals are speakers trying to achieve, and how do they use language, and how do they craft their utterances to achieve those goals. We start from the idea that speakers have at least two basic informational goals when producing utterances. The first goal is that of reference. To identify the target object, speaker and listener need to converge on a thing that we're talking about. Once that is achieved, you can then predicate a property of that referent. Here, you might say that Great Dane is big, and so that provides to you the predicate. Speakers need to achieve these goals somehow. In simple subject-predicate sentences, listeners may expect speakers to establish reference in the subject of the sentence and use the predicate to predicate. So in the sentence, "that Great Dane is big," the noun Great Dane appears in the subject, and hence listeners may expect it's more likely to be used for reference. That is, its utility in reference may explain away its usage. In this way, reference and predication, those goals can trade off with one another. When the noun is being used to establish reference, listeners might use their world knowledge and more general pragmatic reasoning to come up with the comparison class. In this case, reasoning Great Danes are big dogs, so likely it's big for a dog. When now in a sentence that is seemingly truth conditionally identical, that is the sentence, "that is a big Great Dane," which has all the same words as the previous sentence, it might in fact not be identical because it implies something different about the comparison class. The fact that Great Dane appears in the predicate maybe it is less likely to be used for reference and hence more likely to be used to establish the comparison class, as in the speaker meaning big for a Great Dane. We test these predictions in 3 experiments using different dependent measures. In the first one, we have participants rate the felicity or goodness of sentences which differ in the syntactic position of the noun. In the second experiment, we have participants freely produce nouns for certain syntactic positions. In the third experiment, we directly test comparison class inferences. This is the main experiment. Here, participants are asked to explicitly paraphrase the sentence that they hear with a comparison class. Finally, I'll share with you some pilot results we have from an experiment investigating further the role of direct modification. Let me say a word about the stimuli. There are visual stimuli, and they're all the referents are always normal or typically sized members of subordinate categories. And the subordinate categories are these sort of extreme subordinate categories, like Great Danes are big dogs. We use the adjectives big and small because they describe size, which can be easily conveyed visually. And we always use the adjective that is consistent with listeners' general expectations about the category. That is, when big is used to, we always use big to describe the Great Dane, and we always use small to describe a Chihuahua. And there are 6 other sets of reference from 6 different basic level categories. We do this adjective that's consistent with the expectations to allow for uncertainty in the comparison class, that when a listener hears that the Great Dane is big, they might think that it's big for a Great Dane, but they could also just think that it's big for a dog. And this allows us to see how these inferences change with the various cues we investigate. So in experiment 1, participants see these displays with here depicted with other dogs. The referent here is the Chihuahua, and then they hear that Chihuahua is small, or that's a small Chihuahua. They rate how good the sentence is. When the noun appears in the subject, we see no difference between the subordinate noun and the basic level noun. They're both equally good. When the noun appears in the predicate, however, participants like less the sentence that uses the subordinate noun. That's a big Great Dane to describe a normal-sized Great Dane seems not as good. And the relevant interaction is there. In experiment 2, we look at what nouns participants freely produce. So you have the same basic setup, but now you are saying to your friend, that's a big, and then you can say whatever you want. And we code responses in terms of whether or not they're a basic level noun or a subordinate level noun. What we see is that when the noun appears in the subject of the sentence, participants like to use the subordinate level noun more. They like to say that Great Dane is big. However, when the noun appears in the predicate of the sentence, participants are more likely to say, use the basic level noun, that's a big dog. And the reason we think is that if you were to say that's a big Great Dane, that would lead to the wrong interpretation because of the implications for the comparison class that the listener is thinking about. In our main experiment, we directly test or we directly measure comparison class inferences. We do this by manipulating the syntactic position of the noun in the way that we're all familiar with at this point, as well as the noun type. And here we use the basic level and subordinate level nouns as we've used before. We also use the anaphoric one, and that is to relate to the context manipulation. In the physical context, the participant either sees a display of other basic level category members, like other dogs, or subordinate level category members, like other Great Danes. And the meaning of one should be different based on these different physical contexts, and one is sort of a baseline. This is what the experiments looked like. You and your friend see the following. Here's the basic level context, a bunch of dogs. Then you read your friend runs far ahead of you and you see him in the distance. So you can't use the physical size of the Great Dane in the distance as a cue to the comparison class, but you do see its category membership. It is a Great Dane. And then your friend says, that's a big Great Dane. Here we have the predicate noun phrase syntax, and the noun is the subordinate category label. Then you're asked, what do you think your friend meant? It is big relative to other, and then you can freely respond. We again code whether or not they produce relative to other dogs or relative to other Great Danes, basic or subordinate level. This is a different stimulus. This is the subordinate level context with the syntactic, the noun is in the predicate again, and the noun is a basic level dog. First, we look at the effect of context. We see that context has a big effect on the interpretation of the anaphoric 1. So in the basic level context, participants hear that's a big 1 or that 1 is big, and they think it's big relative to other dogs. And in the subordinate level context, they're more likely to think it's big relative to other Great Danes. Note, however, in the subordinate level context, there is still a basic level bias. That is, participants still interpret the sentence as meaning it's big relative to other dogs. When the sentence has the basic level noun in it, like that dog is big or that's a big dog, participants are more likely to infer the comparison class to be dogs. In the subordinate level context, where the flexibility can be seen, in the basic level context, they're at ceiling. And then critically, we want to see what happens with the subordinate level noun. So when participants hear that Great Dane is big, they are somewhat more likely to infer that the referent is big relative to other Great Danes. When they see the noun in the predicate, that's a big Great Dane, they are even more likely to infer that the referent is big relative to other Great Danes. We see the same sensitivity to syntax in the subordinate level context, and the relevant syntax by noun phrase interaction is present in our data. That is, when participants see that's a big Great Dane, they're more likely to infer the comparison class to be Great Danes relative to when they see that Great Dane is big, and using as a baseline either the basic level noun or the anaphoric 1. To summarize, we see that human listeners flexibly integrate syntactic information with their world knowledge and the physical environment to infer the comparison class intended by the speaker. We provide evidence for this in 3 experiments using diverse dependent measures, syntax ratings, noun phrase reproduction, and comparison class inferences. And these inferences are in a manner consistent with an information structural account. That is, when the noun appears in the subject of the sentence, it can be explained away by its utility in reference. And the general inference we try to model or try to measure is that that Great Dane is big is interpreted as big for a dog, but that's a big Great Dane is interpreted as big for a Great Dane. We are investigating this further by noting that the subject-predicate distinction in our paper is perfectly confounded with direct syntactic modification. But this confound is not necessary. That is, you can have direct syntactic modification in the subject of the sentence, as in, that big Great Dane is a prize winner. And the question is whether it is direct syntactic modification or reference predication as operationalized using the subject-predicate distinction that matters for comparison class inference. And what we're finding in the pilot data is that it is the reference predication distinction that matters. So these are replication data of our critical condition that Great Dane is big is interpreted as big for a dog, whereas that's a big Great Dane is interpreted more so as big for a Great Dane. And when you have direct modification in both cases, that big Great Dane is a prize winner. That patterns more with the subject noun phrase. What matters is that the noun phrase is in the subject, as opposed to the fact that it's being directly modified by the adjective. Studying comparison classes is a case study of the more general problem of understanding the aspects of context that need to be recruited to understand the meaning of a speaker's message. We show that listeners use expectations about how speakers package information into sentences in order to pragmatically reconstruct the relevant aspects of context needed to understand. This suggests a very flexible interface between the structure of sentences, the meanings of those words in the sentence, and social reasoning and context. In other words, between syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And models of language understanding should be developed with such a flexible interface in mind. Thank you for your attention. I am happy to take your questions at this time or in the future. You can just email me if you would like. Thank you.